emotions come in four basic categories. There's sad, angry, which is afraid, happy, and calm. Sadness is about pain, loss, grief. It requires care or affection. When we feel sad, it's an opportunity for us to explore self-care. Anger is about fear or an unmet need. It requires soothing, safety, or space, which is a form of safety. When we feel angry, it's an opportunity to learn about where are our boundaries? What are our limits? What do we want to do and not? Happiness is about celebration. It requires permission. In order to feel happy, we need to feel like we're allowed to. When we feel happy, it's an opportunity for us to get familiar with what brings us joy. And then feeling calm is obviously about peace. It requires gratitude. And just like happiness, it's an opportunity to get familiar with the feeling of peaceful self-control. Learning to approach our emotions with a learning mindset allows us to expand. Consciously practicing curiosity, compassion, gentleness towards ourselves naturally allows us to curate the rest of our lives in the same way. When we accept those weaknesses and we understand like, hey, like this is a thing that I'm afraid of, we now have the capacity to turn that into a benefit. I want to take a little bit of a moment to discuss shame, trauma, and maybe like a little bit about religion. A past shrink of mine once told me, shame is just anger directed inwards. Also, if you've experienced any kind of childhood trauma, make sure you read this book. It's called It Wasn't Your Fault by Beverly Engels. She talks about how shame is the consistent result of childhood trauma. No matter what, anyone that experiences childhood trauma has some sort of shame. And then she goes on and on to talk about how self-compassion is the cure for shame. The general gist of the book is when we experience abuse in childhood, our brains internalize it. The same brain that's looking for brambles and predators out in the wild also knows that caregivers and authorities in our community are the sources of vital information for us to survive. So when someone whose opinion matters gives the opinion that we're bad, our brain comes to the natural conclusion that the teacher is correct. So another dimension to this is self-worth. Our caregiver relationships are what become the baseline for intimate relationships. What we're used to is what we're going to accept. You can also approach this from a vibration perspective. What we think about is what we receive. It's confirmation bias. What we look for is what we find. When we go through foundational trauma, we're often set up for complex trauma over the course of our lives. Our brains are just pattern machines. The practice of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn is then matched by the physical thickness of those patterns in the brain. The more you do something, the thicker that pathway is, right? So it's easier to travel, and your brain will, the more time you've spent having a trauma response, the easier it is for your brain to have that trauma response again. But then there's this thing called neuroplasticity, which is our brain's ability to reorganize itself and make new connections. Our brain retains this flexibility well into the adult years, but basically our brain has a maximum amount of mass that it can have. And this means that in order to break down the superhighways of things that we've had for a long time, like anxious thought patterns, depression, etc., we have to tread new paths. That's it. And please, don't put pressure on yourself if your patterns don't change after like a day or a week or a month. Lasting change takes time. If you can, go back and read an old journal entry. Don't be afraid to celebrate how far you've come.